Good morning. My name is Carl Saz. I'm the president of Verde Capital Management, and I'm going to be doing a quick presentation for you, updating you on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. During this presentation, we're going to be making sense of the situation. Why does Putin want to invade Ukraine? We'll talk about the effects on the Russian economy. What lessons can we learn from past Russian aggression? What effects will this likely have on the Russian currency, the economy, and its export partners? Then we'll talk about the stock market reaction. How has the market reacted to the current situation? How should investors react? What can you do in particular? And we'll talk last about the negativity bias and using rational thinking to improve decision-making and our decision-making process. And we'll ask one final question, which is the world getting better or worse? So let's get started. First, relating to the question of why does Putin want to invade Ukraine? This is actually a map of Europe, and I was reminded today when I was talking to one of my colleagues that not everybody knows every country in Europe, so I'm going to name some of these just geographically so that we kind of know where everything is. So Russia is going to be over here to the right. It's kind of in the vast gray section over here. Ukraine is the country that you see in yellow over here, and Crimea, which is kind of the lower portion of Ukraine, is what was annexed by Russia back in 2014. You'll see here that when NATO first got started back in 1949, shortly after World War II, it was primarily in Western Europe. And the countries that you see here with Iceland, Norway, the UK, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, even Portugal, those were the original members of the NATO alliance, along with the United States and Canada. And then shortly after that, Germany, which is the big country here in the center, Spain, Turkey, Greece joined between 1952 and 1982. And most of the Eastern European countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, which is where I'm from, and Bulgaria, these countries didn't join until much, much later. These countries, in fact, before the fall of the Soviet Union, were part of the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was the kind of counterpoint to NATO, which was the Soviet alliance of most Eastern Bloc countries. But as you can see, what's happened over the years has been that a lot of those Eastern Bloc countries, essentially traditional Russian allies, have now switched and they've become NATO allies at this point. And when you look at Vladimir Putin in particular, he's been watching NATO get larger and larger and his sphere of influence getting smaller and smaller. At this point, NATO is almost 30 nations large, with Ukraine and Croatia wanting to join, along with Georgia here to the south. We're really looking at a situation where on the western front of Russia, you could be looking at a very strong NATO alliance in Europe. And then, of course, east to Russia is going to be Canada and the U.S., which are both NATO allies. So Russia is essentially engulfed on all sides by NATO. In our estimation, what we think Vladimir Putin is trying to do is essentially create a buffer zone between him and NATO. There's already a pretty strong ally here with Belarus. If he was to peel off some parts of both Georgia and Ukraine and create separatist areas, that would create a buffer zone between Russia and NATO and the West. Remember, an attack upon one NATO ally is an attack upon all of them due to Article 5 in the NATO Charter. So if, even if this was, let's say, the strongest, biggest bully on the playground, you got to think that even one of these really small kids here, if they have 30 friends along with them, are going to be a formidable adversary for them. So, this you can kind of see how this situation might have formed. So let's talk a little bit about just kind of the effects on Russia's economy, starting with its currency. And really this graph that you see here is the Russian ruble to the United States dollar. And we've just kind of put on here back in 2014, you could see that it used to be 1 ruble equaled approximately 3 cents. And shortly after the invasion of Crimea, which again is the last major point of Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, the value of the ruble dropped very decisively in half, from really 3 cents to 1.5 cents. And This is happening again right now. In fact, since the start of the aggression against Ukraine, we've seen actually the Russian ruble drop about 10% at the time of this presentation. And then I believe today it also dropped another 15 or 20%. What that really means is that for everyday Russians trying to transact business in Russia, everything just became twice as expensive, right? So if your currency drops in half, it's essentially going to take twice as much of that currency to buy the same thing. So if you want an iPhone and it cost, let's just say, 500 rubles before, it would cost 1,000 rubles today. And that's a really significant development because with the devaluation of their currency, it makes everything really expensive in Russia right now. So there's a very direct consequence to the Russian people. Number two, what you could see is that, again, I've depicted kind of 2 points of time here. One being, again, after the Crimean annexation by Russia. At that time, there were some pretty significant sanctions placed on Russia by the West, and we saw that their country actually went into recession. And so this is the gross domestic product of Russia at the time, about $1.575 billion. Just to give you an example, the U.S. economy is I believe somewhere around 18 trillion. So 1.575 trillion is about less than a tenth of the U.S. economy by size comparison. But you can see here that Russia's economy went into recession and didn't fully recover until about 4 years later, which is a pretty long recession. To give you an example, the COVID-19 crisis in the U.S. lasted about 3 months, and the full recovery took almost a year. So to have a 4-year-long recession is a pretty long time. Those sanctions from 2014 really did do a number on the Russian economy. And then, of course, you could see that the economy recovered for 2 more years until the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and Russia took a pretty big hit during COVID as well and hasn't yet fully recovered from its pre-pandemic high. So Russia's still in recession from COVID, and of course the double hit now with the Ukraine sanctions should most certainly cause GDP to go down this next year. So what this has really meant for Russia is that if you look at Russia over the last 10 years, its economy has basically stagnated. It's had 2 separate recessions, and it's cost it dearly in terms of development. Now, what does Russia actually do in terms of exports? About 30% of Russia's economy is exports, and over half of those are minerals. Minerals are essentially things that are found in the ground. So think of oil or natural gas or iron ore. And again, of the mineral products that it exports, most of them are energy, right? It's going to be things like natural gas or oil. So think of Russia as like the gas station of Europe. It's a giant gas station. And even though Russia exports a lot of gas and oil, most people don't know that the U.S. is actually the largest exporter of oil and gas in the world now, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia. So the U.S. is producing, thanks to fracking, more oil and natural gas than it ever has before. It's increasingly using that excess to export to other places in the world. But outside of minerals, you can see that Russia doesn't really produce much for export. Precious stones, precious metals, different types of foodstuffs like wheat and agricultural products, some metals like aluminum, and certain chemical products like rubber, and then of course wood pulp and paper products, but not a lot of exports to speak of. And when you look at the major exporting partners of Russia, it should be no surprise here that China is their number one export market. And then outside of that is most of the European countries, most of which have at this point announced sanctions against Russia. So the countries that you see in orange are all of the countries that have already mentioned that they're going to be sanctioning Russia. And these are countries that historically have always sided with the U.S. and Canada when it comes to, they're seen as Western countries that all kind of work in tandem. But some of these countries are new to the sanctions regime. So, for example, South Korea and Japan did not impose sanctions during the Crimea annexation, but have imposed sanctions today. primarily to cut Russia off from importing high-tech goods that they could use in the war efforts, such as semiconductor chips and very high-tech, graphics cards, different things that would come from places like Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan. So when you look at this, again, over 2/3 of Russia's export partners have essentially now shunned it by cutting off either exports, imports, and of course, these are just a number of inconveniences now to the Russian people. If you can't get semiconductor chips, your technology is basically frozen in its current state. You can't upgrade your computers, you can't upgrade your phones. In case something breaks, you can't really fix it. So this is going to have a really important impact on Russia's ability to upgrade its technology over time. And as you can see here, again, looking back at the Crimea situation, after those sanctions took effect, Russian exports were impacted by 43%. There was a 43% drop in its exports, and there was a 36% drop in its imports during that time. By comparison, just to show you the effect of COVID-19 on the Russian economy, it was not nearly as bad, with 21% drop in exports and about a 5% drop in imports. So COVID-19 had nowhere near the effect of the sanctions that were imposed after Crimea and the sanctions that are likely imposed today. So what has happened to the Russian stock market? Well, again, we can look at history as a guide. And here is the Russian stock market from 2014, showing again Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine back in February, and then their kind of perpetuous drop after that, somewhere around 50%. And while the U.S. market here, depicted in orange, dropped a little bit at the beginning of the crisis, you could see that it largely recovered that drop and continued. And this is something to really just kind of show that Russia is really not that critical to the global economy and to the U.S. economy. It's a small player. It tends to play in only the commodity space. And given the fact that the U.S. is largely energy independent from Russia, it really doesn't matter that much. The U.S. Stock market is paying much more attention to interest rates, inflation, problems that we have going on over here than what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So let's talk a little bit about what's been happening recently. So again, this graph was from 2014, and then this graph is from today. So again, here you see Russia's stock market and kind of the big drop that it's seen recently with the invasion of Ukraine. And then again, you can see the U.S. stock market. And the U.S. stock market has actually started to go back up a little bit recently. It's not that the U.S. stock market doesn't appreciate the death toll and just the misery that is happening in some of these countries. But again, it's looking at this in context. And we'll talk more about that in just a second, as just one of many problems that it's trying to overcome. And there are greater problems, greater threats to the U.S. economy than the Russian invasion of Ukraine at this time. So how should investors react? Well, if it isn't obvious from the graphs that I've already mentioned, number one, avoid investing in Russian stocks. History has shown that sanctions are very effective, and investors will likely shun Russian stocks for the foreseeable future. So we don't really have any investments in the Russian stock market, but if you own any large Russian stocks like Lukoil or Rosneft or Gazprom, those would all be investments that you should probably sell. Russia has closed its stock market up until March 5th to avoid people from panicking and selling. But most certainly there's going to be an exodus from Russian stocks, as there already has been. Number two, and this is less obvious, hedge foreign currency exposure. So even if you're not invested in Russia, but you're invested in Europe or you're invested in places like Canada, typically what we see when there's any geopolitical risk like this, that investors will typically flock to U.S. Treasuries for safety, pushing up the value of the dollar. This has a negative side effect of hurting any investments in foreign currency. So hedging currency risk is a prudent strategy to avoid a double whammy of stock market losses and then currency losses. An example of this is many of us living in Michigan might own property, let's say in Canada, okay? And if, let's say, for example, the value of that property were to drop because of geopolitical events, and the value of the dollar versus the Canadian dollar were to go up, you would have a double hit, not just a hit from the value of your investment dropping in Canada, but also the hit from the currency fluctuation. So at Verde, we use futures, forwards, certain types of options that are embedded in some of our international investments to really hedge out the foreign currency exposure, to make it so that if a currency drops against the dollar, it really won't impact our investments. And we've seen actually the dollar appreciate by about 5% from where it was last year to today. So this is important. And then the last thing is think before overreacting. No one can really predict the future, but historically the U.S. market, represented by the S&P 500 index, has bounced back relatively quickly from conflicts like this over time. Since 1941, most geopolitical events have dropped the U.S. market 5% on average before eventually recovering after a few months. And of course, even though history isn't necessarily a guarantee of what could happen in the future, it is an indication of what might happen in the future. So let's finish up with one last thing. I started this presentation with a picture of a tank and a person on it. And that was done on purpose, really just to kind of give you a sense for how the media and journalism is reported today. Journalism today, if I had one word to kind of describe it, is very incident-based, right? You can look at that tank, the soldier on it, and think to yourself, wow, this looks horrible. What good can possibly come out of this? And the answer is not much, but it doesn't really give you any context or trends or statistics related to that. And really, when we look at the question of, is the world getting better or worse? And specifically, let's just talk about it in terms of deaths in state-based conflicts, meaning are more people dying today in war than there were people dying in war before? Okay, and this graph really from a project called Our World in Data really looked at this and said how many people per year were dying back in 1946, 1960, 1970 in all different areas of the world related to war. And we can see that even very recently here with the Syrian conflict in the Middle East, there were many, many people dying in wars, but the general trend has been downward, which means that today, despite the fact that we still have about 50,000 people a year dying in state-based conflicts, that is lower than it's almost ever been. So the question of, is the world getting better or worse, is it's undoubtedly getting better, but we don't really feel that way, right? And so why is that, right? And how should we become more rational in our thinking? So number one, I would say the main question that I get all the time is, Carl, should I go with my gut or with my instinct? And I say neither. In fact, this is some of the worst advice that you can ever give anybody, is to trust their gut when it comes to investing. When you trust your gut or you go with your instinct, you're choosing to ignore the rational part of your mind, the more developed prefrontal cortex, in favor of the limbic system, which is really that subconscious part of the mind, the more animalistic part of the mind. And the animalistic part of the mind really only thinks about fight or flight, right? And so it's not a proper tool for evaluating what should be done in a situation like this. It's not an analysis tool, right? And so I think it's better to think twice, to reflect on which of your beliefs might be false, to be open to evidence that your beliefs might be false, and to change your mind when the evidence presents itself. Number two, I think it's important to be conscious of the availability bias. Our view of the world is shaped by the availability bias, which is driven by memorable events. So again, if we go back to that tank, or if we see a lot of journalism focused on things like terrorism, you would falsely conclude that terrorism is the greatest threat to life and limb, when in fact, many more people die from car accidents, falls off ladders, and drownings than have ever been killed by terrorists. But because of that availability, the media can actually falsely give us the impression that somehow terrorism is more dangerous than drowning, which it isn't. And then three, if I had one wish, it's that we as a group would become more data-driven. Focus more on data and statistics, trends versus just incidents. It's not enough to just know what is happening right now and assume it's always bad. How does what is happening right now compare to what happened in the past? Yes, there's a war going on, and all war is tragic. All loss of life is tragic. But how does that war compare to the wars of the past? Is there more war today than before or less? So with that in mind, I'm going to just give you a couple of resources to consider. And these are really great tools that I've found can help you have let's just call it a low bad diet when it comes to things that you put inside of your mind. Most of our minds have kind of this open door. We just kind of let everything in. And I would encourage us to close that door and to allow ourselves only to open it when we are giving ourselves a low bad diet of information. The sources that I've cited here are really about things that we can use to help us get context, facts, statistics that will help us to understand the current situation in context to what has happened in the past. So I'll kind of leave you with one question, which is the question that we asked at the beginning: how is the world changing? Is it getting better or worse? And there's a project out there called Our World in Numbers that really attempts to answer this question. In surveys all around the world, about 10% of the world population thinks that the world is actually getting better. About 22% thinks it's staying about the same, and about 60+% is thinking it's getting worse overall. And when asked more pointedly, what about things like infant mortality, or what about poverty, or the number of people that are dying in wars, or democracy worldwide, right? Are things getting better or worse? Again, what we found was that most people had a very pessimistic view, as if the world was getting worse. And it was actually more prevalent in rich countries than poor countries, meaning somebody in Kenya or somebody in China generally was more optimistic than somebody in, let's say, the US or France. So these tools are really tools that you can use to give yourself some data that will help you to understand what is happening today and how is it in relation to historically. There is a written version here called Most of Us Are Wrong About How the World Has Changed, especially those who are pessimistic about the future. There's a visual YouTube TED article from actually a great author. His name is Steven Pinker, who's a Harvard professor that really looked at numbers over time. And then there's a game that you can play on a site called humanprogress.org. I've linked it here. This is a game where you can explore how much the world has changed since you were born. I was able to go in there and put in my year of birth, which is 1983, and my country of origin, which is Romania, and see how the world has changed over that time in Romania. But you can, of course, put the United States in there, your year of birth, and see on a variety of factors how the world has gotten better or worse. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that. Call us if you have any questions related to the crisis in Ukraine and how it might be affecting your investments. And I'll leave you with just a few source slides and disclosures here to finish us off. Thank you. And again, call us if you have any questions. We look forward to hearing from you.